Imagine yourself on a suffocating island in the middle of the Pacific. The air, heavy and humid, sticks to your skin. The smell of salt and decay from the mangroves mingle. The only constant sound is the incessant buzzing of insects and, more disturbing than any noise, the tense silence that precedes the bombardment. In an environment where every sound could be the last, a sound cuts through the air. It's not the familiar roar of an engine, but a high-pitched howl, a ghostly whistle that seems to tear through the sky itself. It starts low, almost imperceptible, and builds to a terrifying crescendo, a metallic wail that silences the trenches and artillery positions in unison. This was the calling card of a predator. Before the silhouette of any plane could be seen, the sound arrived first, an audible omen of destruction. For the soldiers of the Japanese Empire, entrenched on islands like Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and Okinawa, that sound had a name: Shinofue, the whistle of death. Or to the Americans, simply, whistling death. This howl was not an intentional accessory, a psychological weapon engineered in a laboratory. It was an accident of physics, an aerodynamic anomaly that became one of its most terrifying characteristics. Air, forced at high speed into the inlets of the oil coolers located at the root of the wings, created a unique resonance, a macabre musical note that echoed for miles. At diving speeds reaching over 800 kilometers per hour, the air rushed through the ducts with tremendous force, creating a whistle that was both the sound of power and the signal of an imminent attack, a note that meant the most brutal fighter of World War II was hunting. The psychological impact was devastating. It demoralized, broke discipline, and spread panic before the first shot was fired. For the American Marines on the ground, however, the same sound was a symphony of salvation. It was the announcement that the guardian angels, or rather the avenging demons, had arrived. The sound that preceded the vision, the terror that preceded the attack. This is the story not just of a war machine, but of its signature sound, a howl that became the soundtrack to the end of Japanese aerial dominance in the Pacific.
To understand the visceral need behind the creation of the Corsair, we must go back in time to the very moment when the world of aviation changed forever. December 7th, 1941. On that day, the Empire of the Rising Sun didn't just attack ships at Pearl Harbor, it shattered America's illusion of security. The sound of that attack wasn't just the sound of exploding bombs, it was the echo of an imperial empire that, driven by an efficient war machine and an expansionist ideology that broke no limits, swept across the Pacific. Japanese expansion was swift, brutal, and humiliating. Guam and Wake Island fell in a matter of days. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, entire nations fell like dominoes, a display of power that shocked the world. Allied defenses crumbled before a relentless and well-coordinated force. The Japanese Empire wasn't just winning, it was dominating. In the sky, the situation was even bleaker, and the reason for Japan's success had a name: the Mitsubishi A6M0. If the standard American naval fighter, the Grumman F4F Wildcat, was a courageous aircraft, it was fundamentally outclassed. It was heavy, slow, and poorly maneuverable. Its design prioritized robustness and pilot protection, making it a solid platform capable of withstanding damage, but lacking the agility required for small-scale aerial combat. The Wildcat was like a boxer battling a ballet dancer. Its adversary, the legendary Zero, was the opposite. It was the product of a radically different design philosophy. Constructed of lightweight materials and lacking pilot armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, the Zero was an acrobat, agile as a feather and with a formidable range. It danced through the skies, climbing at breakneck speed and turning in an incredibly small space, shooting down Allied fighters with humiliating ease.
Japanese pilots, masters of a form of aerial combat the West hadn't seen since World War I, used the Zero's maneuverability to dictate the pace of the fight. American pilots in their Wildcats had to employ defensive and team tactics, such as the famous Thatch Weave, just to survive an engagement. The tactic, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, was a pincer movement in which two Wildcats flew together. When a Zero approached to attack one of them, the other Wildcat would turn and fire on the enemy's approaching trajectory. It was an ingenious survival maneuver, but also a testament to the enemy's technological disadvantage. Victory was the exception, not the rule. The wounded and outmatched American Navy knew that future battles would be won or lost in the skies above its fleets. Aircraft carriers, the backbone of its power, were defenseless against Japan's perfect fighter. The United States desperately needed a technological miracle. It wasn't enough to create a plane that could go toe-to-toe with a Zero. It was necessary to create a plane that would annihilate it, that would surpass it in speed and firepower. A fighter that could dictate the rules of combat, that combined speed, firepower, and endurance in a way never before seen. The order was given to the engineers, a single, visceral instruction that reverberated through the design tables of the aviation industry. Build us a Zero killer.
In 1938, even before war engulfed the world, the U.S. Navy anticipated the need for a new generation of fighters. Aware that their aircraft carriers would be the heart of future fleets, and aware of the rapid modernization of European powers in Japan, naval leaders issued an unprecedented call for proposals. The official request was audacious, almost fanciful for the time. A carrier-based fighter that was not only fast, but the fastest of all, on land or at sea. It would have an exceptional rate of climb and carry heavy armament, enough to shoot down anything that flew. It was, in essence, a quest for the ultimate fighter. Many companies rose to the challenge, but it was Chance Vought, led by visionary engineer Rex B. Beisel, that presented the most radical proposal. While competitors opted for incremental improvements to existing models, Beisel and his team decided to build their aircraft around the most powerful component money could buy: the engine. The stakes were high, but the reward would be a machine like no other. And what an engine they chose! The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It wasn't an engine, it was a powerhouse. An 18-cylinder air-cooled monster capable of generating 2,000 horsepower. To give you an idea, the engine of the famous British Supermarine Spitfire barely reached 1,000 horsepower at the start of the war. Beisel bet everything on raw power, believing that speed was the key to survival and victory. The philosophy was simple and brutal. If the enemy can't reach you, they can't shoot you down. The problem was that taming a monster like the R2800 and placing it on the deck of an aircraft carrier was an engineering challenge bordering on the impossible. The very power that would make the plane unbeatable in combat threatened to render it incapable of even leaving the ground safely.
The decision to use the R2800 engine was the starting point, but also the origin of an engineering nightmare. To translate 2,000 horsepower into thrust, a standard propeller wasn't enough. A propeller of epic proportions, over 4 meters in diameter, was required. And here, physics imposed its tyranny, creating a seemingly insoluble dilemma. A naval fighter needs short, sturdy landing gear to withstand hard landings on an aircraft carrier deck, where the aircraft impacts with the force of a hammer. But with such a gigantic propeller, a short landing gear would cause the blades to hit the ground. The obvious solution would be to lengthen the landing gear to ensure the necessary clearance. But this would create another insoluble problem. A long landing gear would be heavy, dangerously unstable for the aircraft, and extremely difficult to retract into the thin, aerodynamic wings of a fighter.
Every extra centimeter in the landing gear leg meant more weight, more drag, and greater vulnerability in the event of a hard landing. The project reached an impasse. Basil's team was caught in a seemingly insurmountable dilemma. Power demanded a propeller demanded long landing gear, and long landing gear made the aircraft unsuitable for the Navy. It seemed the ambition to create the ultimate fighter would die on the drawing board, a victim of its own monstrous specifications. Vought had the muscle, the vision, but no way to make the math work. The risk of the project failing before even a prototype was built was immense, and the race against time seemed to be on. The solution to the impasse came not from a tweak, but from a true design revolution. Rex Beasel's team was trapped in a seemingly insoluble paradox. The physics of the engine and propeller demanded a long landing gear, but naval engineering demanded a short, robust, and simple landing gear. The problem was a crossroads: accept an inefficient design or give up the overwhelming power of the R2800 engine. Instead of changing the engine, propeller, or landing gear, they changed the shape of the plane itself. It was in this moment of genius that Vought created the legendary and unmistakable inverted Gullwing. The logic behind the design was simultaneously simple and ingenious. The wing curved downward from the fuselage at a sharp angle and then extended upward, as if a seagull's wings dipped inward toward the body. The lowest point of this curve was precisely where the landing gear would be installed. This allowed engineers to use a short, strong landing gear, as the drop in the wing already provided the necessary height for the colossal propeller to avoid hitting the ground. The problem was solved in a way no one else had even conceived, and the solution was a testament to human ingenuity. While other fighters, like the P-47 Thunderbolt, were forced to use complex and heavy telescopic landing gear to accommodate their large engines, the Corsair solved the dilemma with a simple geometry change. But the benefits didn't stop there. This unique wing, born of engineering necessity, turned out to be a source of unexpected aerodynamic advantages. The curve at the junction of the wing and fuselage drastically reduced aerodynamic drag, a common problem in low-wing fighters that created turbulence and reduced speed at high power. The clean aerodynamic gull wing shape smoothed the airflow, allowing the Corsair to reach even higher speeds, pushing the limits of what was possible for a piston-powered aircraft. The design also allowed the landing gear to retract rearward, simply and directly into the lower wing section. This eliminated the need for complex and fragile mechanisms, increasing the aircraft's reliability and simplifying field maintenance, a crucial factor in wartime. And, as a bonus, the solution to an engineering problem gave the Corsair an aggressive, predatory silhouette unlike anything else in the sky. Compared to fighters of the era, such as the elliptical-winged Spitfire or the straight-winged Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Corsair seemed like a creature from another world. Its iconic, unmistakable shape became synonymous with power and ferocity. That plane, which nearly failed due to a design contradiction, emerged with a solution so elegant and functional that it ended up becoming its own trademark, giving the plane its soul and its eternal visual identity. On May 29, 1940, the prototype XF4U-1 took off for the first time, and the power was staggering. The roar of the R2800 double wasp engine promised unparalleled power, and the aircraft, with its unmistakable silhouette, soared into the sky with impressive force. It seemed as if physics had been tamed, and that the Vought engineering team had, indeed, delivered the future of aviation. The first flights confirmed all expectations. In October of that year, the XF4U-1 broke the 400 miles per hour barrier in level flight.
reaching an impressive 425 miles per hour. It became the first American single-engine fighter to achieve that feat. The plane was a Spear, a rocket with wings. The promise of air superiority seemed fulfilled, and euphoria gripped Vought and the Navy. Finally, America had its own mechanical ace, a machine capable of overcoming any known adversary. But speed is only part of the equation for a naval fighter. The real test of fire would come in handling tests, and more critically, in carrier landing simulations. And that's when the dream began to crumble. As Navy test pilots began flying the prototype, the list of serious problems only grew. The philosophy of designing the aircraft around the engine, while brilliant for speed, had an unintended consequence. The cockpit was so far back in the fuselage that visibility over the aircraft's long nose was poor during the landing approach. The pilot was essentially flying blind, with a limited field of vision that made aligning the aircraft with the deck a dangerous gamble. The brutal torque of the R2800 engine, which guaranteed its speed, made low-speed control a nightmare. Pilots needed superhuman pedal force to combat the torque and maintain lateral stability. It was a constant struggle to keep the aircraft under control. Worst of all, the plane had a vicious tendency to bounce on landing. The oleo-pneumatic landing gear, designed to be robust on land, was too rigid. While absorbing the violent impact of the deck, it did not dissipate the energy, but returned it, ricocheting the plane back into the air, causing catastrophic accidents on a short, moving deck. Added to this was a dangerous tendency to wingtip stall. At low speeds, the left wing would lose lift abruptly and unpredictably, causing the plane to roll to one side. On a landing approach, where speed was already minimal, a wing stall could be fatal, dumping the plane directly into the water or onto the deck. The U.S. Navy's verdict after a series of accidents and incidents was swift and cruel, unsuitable for carrier aircraft operations. The most promising project in American naval aviation had been officially rejected. A spectacular failure, the result of a design that was simultaneously brilliant and fatally flawed. The fighter born to dominate the Pacific skies seemed doomed to remain grounded, a promise unfulfilled, a legend that never took flight.
Rejected by the Navy, the Corsair could have become a mere footnote in aviation history, a technological curiosity that failed its original purpose. A project with monumental potential, it stumbled upon a fatal flaw: its inability to land safely on the decks of aircraft carriers. However, the Corsair's story didn't end with this rejection. It was just beginning, and its redemption would come from an unexpected place. Another branch of the American military, with a radically different mission and philosophy, saw potential where the Navy saw only problems. The United States Marine Corps, the Marines, did not operate from the immense and expensive infrastructure of a naval fleet. They were the spearhead, the amphibious assault force, invading islands and establishing air bases on improvised airstrips, often made of packed earth, crushed coral, or the infamous perforated steel mats known as PSP. For the Marines, the complexities of landing on a moving aircraft carrier deck were irrelevant, as their war was fought on the ground, in mud and sand. What the Marines needed wasn't a delicate aircraft for precise operations. They needed a plane that could operate from these rough bases, that was durable, fast, and, above all, capable of carrying an absurd amount of bombs and ammunition to support the troops on the ground who were fighting an entrenched and fanatical enemy hiding in bunkers and caves. The Corsair, for all its flaws for the Marines, was perfect for this.
Its landing gear, though rigid and prone to bouncing on aircraft carrier decks, was precisely what the Marines needed. The robustness and strength of its legs withstood the pounding of the poorly prepared dirt and coral runways with the strength of a bull. There was no softness, but there was resilience. The speed and firepower that made it Beissel's dream were exactly what the Marines needed to clear the skies and attack enemy positions with overwhelming ferocity. While the Navy passed its Corsairs to the British, who, ironically, would adapt the aircraft for carrier operations successfully and without frequent accidents, the Marines embraced the reject with passion. It was in the hands of Marine squadrons in brutal battles like those of Bougainville, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands that the Corsair began to forge its legend. It was not a deck fighter, it was a weapon of war on land. With every bombing run, every silenced machine gun, every close air support flight, the Corsair proved its worth in ways that Navy testing could never have predicted. It found its true home in the mud and sand of the Pacific Islands, where its ruggedness and power were valued more than the finesse of a perfect landing. Its original flaw became the key to its glory, and the rejected fighter became the Marines' unmistakable guardian angel.
The confrontation was inevitable, a clash not just of machines, but of aerial combat philosophies that clashed violently in the skies over the Pacific. On one side, the Mitsubishi Zero, the master of agility, an air samurai designed for cornering combat, the famous classic dogfight. The Zero was light, unarmored, and with unprotected fuel tanks to maximize its maneuverability and range. The Japanese philosophy was clear: win the fight at the first corner and shoot down the enemy before they could retaliate. On the other, the Corsair, a warhammer forged with brute force, speed, and endurance. It was heavy, with a colossal engine and a robust fuselage, built to absorb damage and fly away. It was not designed to dance in the skies, but to be a strike and interception fighter, a stable and deadly firing platform. The Corsair represented a new combat doctrine, one that prioritized power and surprise over agility. Corsair pilots learned quickly: engaging in a turning fight with the Zero was suicide. The Zero could turn in minimal space, placing itself on the tail of any American fighter trying to play its game. The Corsair's response was to not play. American pilots, instructed by visionary commanders, developed and perfected the tactic known as boom and zoom. Energy versus agility. The Corsair used its superior speed and incredible diving performance to dictate the terms of the fight. It would climb to a higher altitude, out of the Zero's reach, and dive at the enemy at over 500 miles per hour, a 4-ton, 2,000 horsepower Lance. In a split second, its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns spewed a storm of lead, capable of disintegrating the Japanese fighter's fragile structure. After the attack, instead of turning to fight, the Corsair used its energy to climb back up, vertically, where the lighter Zero could not follow. Lightning attack, climb, and repeat. The confrontation boiled down to this: a sudden attack of speed and power, giving the enemy no chance to retaliate. It was a massacre. The Zero, unarmored and with its fuel tanks unprotected to save weight, caught fire easily. The era of its supremacy was over. The air war in the Pacific had definitively turned in favor of the Allies, and the statistics spoke for themselves. For every Corsair lost in aerial combat, 11 Japanese planes were shot down. The howl in the sky was now accompanied by the sound of Zeros falling in flames. The whistle of death was the soundtrack to a decisive victory.
The Corsair's reputation as a fighter killer was only half the story. While the exploits of pilots like Gregory "Pappy" Boynton in the skies over the Solomon Islands cemented its reputation as an aerial predator, its true calling, especially in the hands of the Marines, was as a ground attack machine.
An unparalleled close air support platform, the same rugged chassis and powerful engine that made it a powerful fighter also allowed it to carry a devastating warload, transforming it into a veritable flying tank. This was its primary mission. The Corsair was not just a tool, it was an extension of the infantry artillery. For American troops locked in bloody battles against Japanese bunkers, pillboxes, and machine gun positions on islands like Peleliu and Okinawa, the arrival of the Corsairs was a game-changer. The aircraft could be equipped with two 500-kilogram bombs or an impressive salvo of 8 5-inch HVAR rockets under the wings. This capability transformed the Corsair into a flying artillery piece, capable of delivering massive firepower with precision that naval artillery could not replicate. Corsair ground attack pilots did not have a glamorous mission. They flew low, diving at near vertical angles, ignoring anti-aircraft fire from all directions to deliver their bombs with surgical precision, sometimes just tens of meters from friendly positions. Communication between the pilots and forward air controllers, FACs, on the ground was crucial. Often an FAC, himself under intense enemy fire, guided the Corsair pilot, marking the target with colored smoke or simply pointing. It was a dangerous and deadly dance where mutual trust between the pilot in the air and the soldier in the mud was absolute. Landing on a poorly made dirt runway was only the beginning of the job. The plane was quickly refueled and rearmed, often with bombs, rockets, and, on later missions, devastating napalm. Pilots returned to the skies ready for the next support call without rest. The Corsair's endurance became legendary. Stories and photos from the time show planes returning to their bases with fist-sized holes in their wings, parts of the tail section ripped off, engine cylinders destroyed, and yet still flying. Mechanics were astonished. One plane returned with 50 bullet holes in its fuselage, another with a damaged landing gear, and a third with a third of its wing missing. The radial engine's robustness was unmatched, and the airframe's ability to absorb punishment seemed to defy physics. Nicknamed the bent-wing bastard by its own pilots, a term that, while harsh, expressed a sense of affection and respect for a plane that was difficult to tame but refused to fall, it was a flying tank. To the soldiers on the ground, however, it was not a bastard but an angel. The angel of Okinawa and the angel of Iwo Jima. The sound of their howl, which for the Japanese was a harbinger of death, was for American troops the voice of hope. To be trapped under enemy fire and hear the whistle of a Corsair was the certainty that retribution was coming. The whistle meant hell was about to be unleashed upon the enemy. The Corsair transcended its role as a machine to become a symbol, a winged guardian whose sound, even today, echoes with profound reverence in history. The Corsair that ended the war was not the same as the one that started it. Its early models, brilliant on the drawing board but brutal in practice, were just the starting point. Vogt and the Navy, in a relentless cycle of adaptation and improvement, learned from the blood and sweat of combat, transforming the aircraft into an increasingly lethal and versatile platform. Feedback from the battlefield was fed directly to the design boards in one of the most effective demonstrations of the evolution of military engineering. The first major change came with the F4U-1A. Pilots, especially those in the Marine Corps, clamored for a solution to the chronic visibility problem. The cockpit of the prototype and early production models, with its birdcage structure and low seating position, made it nearly impossible for the pilot to see over the plane's long nose during landing approaches. The solution, though seemingly simple, was revolutionary. The cockpit was raised 7 inches, and a new bubble canopy with fewer frames was introduced. These small changes made a monumental difference for pilots, dramatically improving visibility and safety. Then came the F4U-1D, the model that finally marked the Corsair's full redemption. It became the first to be officially certified for carrier operations by the U.S. Navy. What changed? Vogt added a new fuel injection pump to the engine, but crucially, it was the British who, ironically, solved the problem. The British Royal Navy, facing a shortage of deck fighters, operated the Corsair from its aircraft carriers. They developed a curved landing technique that allowed the pilot to keep the deck in view until the final moment, bypassing the blind spot. This tactic, combined with the aircraft's continuous refinement, finally opened the door to the American naval use of the Corsair. The F4U-1D was also optimized as a fighter bomber with the ability to carry rockets and external fuel tanks, increasing its range and firepower.
But the evolution culminated in the F4U-4, which many consider the definitive World War II version. Equipped with a more powerful R2800-18W engine, which featured a water injection system capable of providing a temporary boost of thrust and a new four-blade propeller, the F4U-4 was faster, climbed faster, and had superior overall performance than any of its predecessors. It was the pinnacle of piston engine fighter technology, a pinnacle of engineering that bordered on science fiction for its time. Concurrently, the Corsair became a multi-role platform, a chameleon of war. Photographic reconnaissance versions, the F4U-1P, and, crucially, night fighters emerged. The F4U-2, equipped with a primitive intersect radar in a pod on the right wing, gave the Americans the ability to hunt Japanese bombers in total darkness, a previously nearly impossible task. The Corsair was no longer just an airplane. It was a constantly evolving weapon system, shaped and refined by the fires of combat. Its history is proof that a fundamentally sound design, combined with adaptation and combat experience, can transform from a failure into a legend.
The solution to the impasse came not from a tweak, but from a true design revolution. Rex Beasel's team was trapped in a seemingly insoluble paradox. The physics of the engine and propeller demanded a long landing gear, but naval engineering demanded a short, robust, and simple landing gear. The problem was a crossroads: accept an inefficient design or give up the overwhelming power of the R2800 engine. Instead of changing the engine, propeller, or landing gear, they changed the shape of the plane itself. It was in this moment of genius that Vought created the legendary and unmistakable inverted Gullwing. The logic behind the design was simultaneously simple and ingenious. The wing curved downward from the fuselage at a sharp angle and then extended upward, as if a seagull's wings dipped inward toward the body. The lowest point of this curve was precisely where the landing gear would be installed. This allowed engineers to use a short, strong landing gear, as the drop in the wing already provided the necessary height for the colossal propeller to avoid hitting the ground. The problem was solved in a way no one else had even conceived, and the solution was a testament to human ingenuity. While other fighters, like the P-47 Thunderbolt, were forced to use complex and heavy telescopic landing gear to accommodate their large engines, the Corsair solved the dilemma with a simple geometry change. But the benefits didn't stop there. This unique wing, born of engineering necessity, turned out to be a source of unexpected aerodynamic advantages. The curve at the junction of the wing and fuselage drastically reduced aerodynamic drag, a common problem in low-wing fighters that created turbulence and reduced speed at high power. The clean aerodynamic gull wing shape smoothed the airflow, allowing the Corsair to reach even higher speeds, pushing the limits of what was possible for a piston-powered aircraft. The design also allowed the landing gear to retract rearward, simply and directly into the lower wing section. This eliminated the need for complex and fragile mechanisms, increasing the aircraft's reliability and simplifying field maintenance, a crucial factor in wartime. And, as a bonus, the solution to an engineering problem gave the Corsair an aggressive, predatory silhouette unlike anything else in the sky. Compared to fighters of the era, such as the elliptical-winged Spitfire or the straight-winged Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Corsair seemed like a creature from another world. Its iconic, unmistakable shape became synonymous with power and ferocity. That plane, which nearly failed due to a design contradiction, emerged with a solution so elegant and functional that it ended up becoming its own trademark, giving the plane its soul and its eternal visual identity.
On May 29, 1940, the prototype XF4U-1 took off for the first time, and the power was staggering. The roar of the R-2800 Double Wasp engine promised unparalleled power, and the aircraft, with its unmistakable silhouette, soared into the sky with impressive force. It seemed as if physics had been tamed and that the Vought engineering team had, indeed, delivered the future of aviation. The first flights confirmed all expectations. In October of that year, the F4U-1 broke the 400 miles per hour barrier in level flight, reaching an impressive 425 miles per hour. It became the first American single-engine fighter to achieve that feat. The plane was a Spear, a rocket with wings. The promise of air superiority seemed fulfilled, and euphoria gripped Vought and the Navy. Finally, America had its own mechanical ace, a machine capable of overcoming any known adversary. But speed is only part of the equation for a naval fighter. The real test of fire would come in handling tests, and more critically, in carrier landing simulations. And that's when the dream began to crumble. As Navy test pilots began flying the prototype, the list of serious problems only grew. The philosophy of designing the aircraft around the engine, while brilliant for speed, had an unintended consequence. The cockpit was so far back in the fuselage that visibility over the aircraft's long nose was poor during the landing approach. The pilot was essentially flying blind, with a limited field of vision that made aligning the aircraft with the deck a dangerous gamble. The brutal torque of the R-2800 engine, which guaranteed its speed, made low-speed control a nightmare. Pilots needed superhuman pedal force to combat the torque and maintain lateral stability. It was a constant struggle to keep the aircraft under control. Worst of all, the plane had a vicious tendency to bounce on landing. The oleo-pneumatic landing gear, designed to be robust on land, was too rigid. While absorbing the violent impact of the deck, it did not dissipate the energy, but returned it, ricocheting the plane back into the air, causing catastrophic accidents on a short-moving deck. Added to this was a dangerous tendency to wingtip stall. At low speeds, the left wing would lose lift abruptly and unpredictably, causing the plane to roll to one side. On a landing approach, where speed was already minimal, a wing stall could be fatal, dumping the plane directly into the water or onto the deck. The U.S. Navy's verdict after a series of accidents and incidents was swift and cruel, unsuitable for carrier aircraft operations. The most promising project in American naval aviation had been officially rejected. A spectacular failure, the result of a design that was simultaneously brilliant and fatally flawed. The fighter born to dominate the Pacific skies seemed doomed to remain grounded, a promise unfulfilled, a legend that never took flight.
The Korean War was the stage where the Corsair proved once and for all that its era was not over. At first glance, the scene seemed surreal. On one side, the gleaming MiG-15, a Soviet jet fighter that symbolized the future of aviation with overwhelming speed and firepower. On the other, the F4U Corsair, a propeller-driven aircraft designed in the 1930s. Comparing a Corsair to a MiG-15 was like comparing a Roman chariot to a high-performance racing car. The MiG was faster, climbed higher, and represented the cutting edge of technology. But war is a matter of applying the right tool to the right job. And for the dirty work of close air support, the Corsair was a superior tool, and its apparent anachronism was actually its greatest advantage. Early jets were notorious for their lack of adaptability. They were built for speed and altitude, not for slow, precise flight just meters above the ground. Their fuel consumption was astronomical. An F-86 Sabre could remain over the battlefield for a mere 20 or 30 minutes before needing to return to base for refueling. This hurry syndrome made them unreliable for the critical task of close air support. A Corsair, on the other hand, with its efficient piston engine, could remain stationary for hours, circling slowly over friendly troops, waiting for the call to attack.
Its low speed, a disadvantage in air-to-air combat against jets, was a virtue in ground attack, allowing the pilot to pinpoint targets and strike them with rockets and, crucially, with devastating napalm. Corsair pilots could fly low and slow, acting as veritable guardian angels for troops on the ground, who felt abandoned by the fast jets that tore through the sky in seconds. Their legendary endurance was more valuable than ever. The Corsair's robust airframe and radial engine, capable of absorbing an incredible amount of damage from small-caliber anti-aircraft weapons, would easily bring down a jet with its more delicate structure. A hit to a jet engine compressor could be fatal, but the Corsair's radial engine was a battle tank, capable of continuing to operate even with damaged cylinders. This made the Corsair the ideal platform for the dirty and dangerous work of flying low over the battle lines. And although it was no longer its primary mission, the old fighter still had venom in its fangs. It could fly slowly, and low speed could be a weapon. In one of the most famous actions of the war, a Marine Corps Corsair pilot, Lieutenant Guy Bordelon, became the Navy's only piston-engine ace in Korea, shooting down 5 enemy aircraft at night on interception missions. In another memorable incident, a Corsair achieved the feat of shooting down a MiG-15, a victory of the propeller-driven David against the jet-powered Goliath, which was forced into a low-altitude, turning battle, a terrain where the Corsair still reigned supreme. It was an anachronism, yes, but a deadly and irreplaceable anachronism.
The trajectory of the F4U Corsair is one of the most fascinating and dramatic redemption stories in military engineering. It is the journey of a project born of the highest ambition, designed to be the fastest and most powerful fighter in the world. In its first flights, it broke speed records, reaching 652 kilometers per hour, 400 miles per hour, an impressive feat for the time. The euphoria was immediate. It seemed the U.S. Navy had the ultimate weapon for the coming war. But in a stroke of brutal irony, this very promise of glory was quickly labeled a failure. Landing tests on aircraft carriers revealed critical flaws. The plane was considered too dangerous, too unstable, and unsuitable for the purpose for which it was designed. Its visibility over the nose was poor. Its rigid landing gear caused it to bounce on the deck, and its tendency to stall at low speeds made landing approaches a life-or-death gamble. The U.S. Navy's verdict was swift and cruel. Unsuitable for carrier operations. Its journey seemed doomed to a footnote in history. But this initial rejection was in fact its salvation. The Corsair was not abandoned, but rather handed over to another branch of the military, the Marine Corps. For the Marines, the complexity of carrier landings was irrelevant. They needed a plane to fight on land, from improvised airstrips on Pacific islands. They saw in the Corsair's robustness and strength the virtues the Navy had overlooked. What was a rigid landing gear for the Navy was a solid and resilient foundation for the Marines' dirt runways. What was an engine with terrifying torque was an engine with the power to carry a devastating war load. It didn't just adapt, it mastered it. The Corsair became a living proof that specifications on paper do not define a weapon's worth. Value is forged in the heat of battle. And glory came. Eventually, the U.S. Navy, seeing the plane's resounding success with the Marines and crucially with the British Royal Navy, which solved the landing problems with new techniques, reversed its decision. With improvements implemented, such as the raised cabin and a new canopy and new curved landing methods, the Corsair finally found its place on the decks of American aircraft carriers, where it became one of the most effective fighter bombers of the late war. The aircraft, rejected as unsuitable for carriers, ended its career as an icon of naval aviation, serving honorably in World War II and the Korean War. A complete journey from failure to glory, an enduring symbol that perseverance and adaptation can transform an outcast into a legend, and that the roar of the whistling death will never be forgotten.
The F4U Corsair's impact didn't end when the last aircraft was retired from active service in the mid-1950s. Although the piston engine era was superseded by jets, the Corsair's design philosophy, prioritizing an overwhelmingly powerful engine and a robust airframe capable of supporting multiple roles, left an indelible mark on American military aviation.
especially at Vought, its creator. The company demonstrated the importance of building the aircraft from the ground up, rather than trying to shoehorn power into a pre-existing structure. This go fast, load heavy, and survive mentality would become a cornerstone of combat aircraft design for decades. The legacy is evident in its direct successor, the Vought F8 Crusader, the last gunfighter of the jet age. The Crusader, like the Corsair, was conceived as a high-performance naval fighter, focusing on speed, firepower, and brutal maneuverability that set it apart from other jets of the era. It inherited the go fast, go heavy mentality that the Corsair popularized. Its designers, many of them veterans of the Corsair project, applied the same logic. The raw power of the Pratt & Whitney J57 jet engine would be the backbone of an aircraft capable of flying fast and fighting aggressively. Later, the philosophy of a large, powerful, and versatile aircraft, capable of being both an air superiority fighter and a bomber, would be echoed in the McDonnell Douglas F4 Phantom II, perhaps the most iconic Western fighter of the Cold War. The Phantom, like the Corsair, wasn't the most agile or the best in turning combat, but it made up for it with raw power, speed, incredible altitude, and a weapon's load capacity unmatched for its time. It was the Corsair of its generation, a robust and adaptable platform designed to dominate through power, not finesse. The Corsair was the bridge. It represented the absolute pinnacle of piston fighter technology, pushing it to limits no one imagined possible. At the same time, it served alongside the first jets, proving that the transition between eras was not abrupt, but rather an overlap where the versatility and reliability of an older design could still be decisive. The Corsair's greatest legacy lies not only in the aircraft that came after, but in the lesson it taught their designers. It proved that the most advanced technology is not always the most effective solution to every battlefield problem. Sometimes what is needed is the most reliable and adaptable platform. The Corsair taught that perseverance, the humility to learn from mistakes, and the courage to innovate can transform what seemed like a failure into one of aviation's greatest icons. Its journey from failure to legend is a story that echoes to this day in the cockpits of modern fighters, reminding us that true victory lies not only in technology, but in the indomitable spirit of those who design and fly it.
Today, the vast majority of the more than 12,500 Corsairs built live only in photographs and history books, silent testaments to an age of heroes and war machines. Only a handful, meticulously restored and maintained by enthusiasts, are still airworthy. They are the stars of air shows around the world, precious relics of a bygone era that refuse to be silent. These machines, once the terror of the skies, are now guardians of memory. And when one of these survivors takes off and the pilot thrusts the engine forward, preparing for a high-speed pass, the sound returns. The howl. That piercing whistle that once spread terror across the Pacific Islands now echoes with a different meaning. It is no longer a sound of death, but a sound of reverence. It is the sound of living history. It is the reminder of a time when human determination and ingenuity combined to create a machine that would change the course of war. This sound transports us back to a time of crisis and heroism. It reminds us of the young pilots who mastered this brutal machine, who became aces flying a plane considered dangerous. It reminds us of the engineers who defied physics to create it, conceiving the inverted Gullwing as an elegant solution to a seemingly insoluble problem. And above all, it reminds us of the troops on the ground who, trapped in the mud and sand, look to the sky for its crooked wing silhouette. For them, the howl was not just a sound, it was the voice of hope, the promise that help was on the way.
The F4U Corsair is not just a collection of metal, wires, and pistons. It is a testament to human ingenuity in times of crisis, a symbol of power, resilience, and, above all, adaptation. Its story, from an ambitious project that nearly became a failure to an icon that dominated the skies of the Pacific and Korea, is an inspiration. That Howl, now fainter and more distant, refuses to die. It lives on in veteran stories, in museums, in books, and most importantly, in the sound of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine. It's a sound that will forever haunt and inspire aviation memory. The legend of the Corsair, the Zero Killer, and the Guardian Angel is a legacy that echoes through generations. To understand the crucial role of the F4U Corsair at Iwo Jima, we must first understand the stage in which it would play its leading role. The year was 1945. The war in the Pacific was already in its fifth year, and the landscape had changed dramatically. Japan, once a dominant naval and air power, had seen its fleet shattered and massive losses of aircraft and experienced pilots. However, Japanese resistance did not wane, but intensified, with a fanatical ferocity that shocked the Allied forces. With each American victory, the Japanese response became more desperate and brutal. The American strategy was clear and brutal, so-called island hopping. But this was no haphazard tactic. It was a surgical advance, calculated to bypass the most insurmountable enemy strongholds, such as Rabaul Island, and focus on capturing strategic points that could be transformed into air and naval bases. The goal was to advance inexorably toward the heart of the Empire of the Rising Sun, sparing as many resources as possible. With each step, however, the price to be paid was increasingly high, measured in blood and sweat. And in the midst of this advance, a small volcanic rock measuring just 20 square kilometers, 1,200 kilometers from Tokyo, gained a vital importance, disproportionate to its size: Iwo Jima. The island, which in Japanese means Sulphur Island, was a perfect support point for Japan's defenses. It housed 2 airstrips and a third under construction, and Japanese aircraft based there constantly threatened the bombing routes of the gigantic B-29 superfortresses. These bombers, which took off from the Mariana Islands more than 2,400 kilometers from Tokyo, were on their round trip, flying for 16 hours without any fighter protection. They were vulnerable to enemy attack and, in an emergency, had no safe place to land. If captured, Iwo Jima would become a crucial strategic base for the Americans themselves. The runways would be used not only as emergency landing pads, saving the lives of thousands of B-29 crews and multi-million-dollar aircraft, but also as bases for escort fighters, such as P-51 Mustangs, which could finally accompany the bombers to Japan. For the Japanese, the loss of the island would be an absolute disaster. Iwo Jima was the last bastion of their external defense. Losing that island would further pave the way for an invasion of Japan itself, which would be an irreparable stain on the empire's honor. Therefore, the order to the Iwo Jima garrison was clear and absolute: hold out to the last man. General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, commander of the Japanese forces on the island, was a shrewd and innovative strategist. He knew that the traditional defense of an island with a massive seaside assault would be suicidal. Instead, he ordered his men to build an impenetrable fortress underground. They dug 20 kilometers of interconnected tunnels, concrete bunkers, and camouflaged pillboxes, transforming every inch of the island into a death trap. His mission, he explained to his men, was not to win the battle, but simply to inflict as many casualties as possible on the invaders, prolonging the war and making it so costly that the Americans would lose the will to fight. He knew there would be no reinforcements or victory. His mission was simply to die honorably, taking as many of the enemy with him as possible. On February 19, 1945, the largest amphibious force in history set sail for the beach at Iwo Jima. More than 70,000 American Marines, the elite of ground combat, landed with the conviction that after a massive naval bombardment, the enemy would be weakened and victory would be swift. What awaited them, however, was an apocalyptic scenario, a hell on earth that defied any and all war experience. The black volcanic sand, heavy and sticky, offered no solid footing, sucking at the soldiers' feet as if the ground itself wanted to swallow them. Every step was a struggle, exhausting them before the battle even began. To make matters worse, the beach was an open plain, devoid of any cover. They were completely exposed, and their anxiety became a physical burden. The first wave of landings was greeted by an eerie silence, a silence that, for the veterans, was more terrifying than the sound of artillery. They knew the enemy was there, watching every move, but the lack of response was proof that something terrible was coming. And then, without warning, the trap snapped shut. General Kirabayashi had abandoned the traditional tactic of fighting on the beach. His defense was underground. The mountains and hills were living caves, teeming with Japanese soldiers hidden in interconnected tunnels and concrete fortifications. Every rock, every shadow hid a machine gun nest or a camouflaged cannon. The Japanese artillery, which had remained silent during the naval bombardment, exploded with fury. The beaches became a slaughterhouse. Within hours, thousands of Americans were dead or wounded. The Marines were trapped, and the battle became a nightmare of hand-to-hand combat, bunker to bunker, a brutal and painful advance. And it was in this chaotic landscape that a new voice joined the battle's chorus. It wasn't the roar of battleships, but a sharp, distant whistle that was fast approaching, the sound of the F4U Corsair. The tilt-wing aircraft, the fighter that had nearly been abandoned, became the lifeline of the ground advance. The Marines on Iwo Jima knew that without air support, every meter of advance would be impossible. Naval artillery couldn't hit hidden targets, and the infantry was completely exposed. The Corsair saw action in the first few days, carrying out low, slow, swooping attacks to find camouflaged Japanese positions. The Corsair became literally the Marines' guardian angel, responding to distress calls directly from the ground, coordinated by forward aerial observers who, in turn, were risking their lives to mark the targets. Its brutality was its efficiency. The 6.5 caliber machine guns didn't sweep trenches, they pulverized them, turning them into nothing. Its 500-kilogram bombs and high-velocity rockets were used to blow open the bunkers, destroying pillboxes buried in the volcanic rock. The Corsair became a flying artillery piece, a relentless warhammer in the hands of the Marines, capable of delivering crushing firepower to a precise point. Corsair pilots dove at near vertical angles, flying so low they could see enemy soldiers running between the craters. They ignored the anti-aircraft fire, knowing their mission was not personal glory, but the salvation of those men trapped in the black sand. The plane became an extension of the Marines' will, a tool that allowed them to project their force onto a seemingly invincible enemy. And the sound of the howl, which had once terrorized the skies, was now the song of hope for the men on the ground.
But the skies over Iwo Jima weren't just American territory. The Japanese resistance, though weakened, still desperately tried to defend the island. Their pilots, mostly young and inexperienced, operated from nearby bases, flying the legendary Mitsubishi A6M-0, which for years was considered an unbeatable fighter in the Pacific. The Zero was the embodiment of Japanese design philosophy: light, agile, and with impressive range. It could turn and maneuver in tight spaces, outmaneuvering any opponent in the tight battle. But the difference was that now, in 1945, the game had completely changed.
War was no longer a duel of honor. The Corsair was a new generation of machines, heavier, more armored, and with superior technological brutality. What had once been a balanced struggle between agility and strength now became a massacre. While the Zeros relied on maneuverability, the Corsairs used speed and power to dictate the rules of combat, ignoring traditional fighting tactics. The Corsair's philosophy was boom and zoom. Dive at the enemy at over 400 miles per hour, fire all 6 of its .50 caliber machine guns, and then climb at high speed to the safety of the heights before the enemy could react. For the Zero pilot, with its fragile structure and lack of armor, it was a desperate and, more often than not, fatal fight. The Corsair was a flying fortress with a robust hull and a Pratt & Whitney engine that could withstand incredible punishment and still fly. The Zero, on the other hand, was so light that often a single .50 caliber machine gun round could rip open its fuselage, ignite its fuel tanks, and bring it down. The duel was not fair. It was brute force against lightness, durability against agility, and victory was assured to the stronger. But the Corsair's true weapon on Iwo Jima was not speed or firepower, but sound. The eerie howl it emitted as it dived became a hallmark of battle, a ghostly melody that pierced the souls of the combatants. Accounts from Japanese soldiers described the whistle as inescapable, a high-pitched note that preceded the devastating impact. It wasn't an engine roar, it was the sound of approaching death. The whistle was a direct result of the plane's aerodynamics, air rushing over the oil and supercharger intakes on the leading edge of the wings. It was as if the plane itself screamed the death knell before firing its machine guns. This psychological terror spread quickly, increasing the fighters' fame and contributing to the weakening of enemy troops' morale. For the Japanese soldier trapped in a bunker, the sound of the approaching Corsair meant that destruction was inevitable. They felt trapped, knowing that no matter how safely underground they were, the fury of the sky would find them. The Corsair's howl became a harbinger of doom, a constant reminder of American air superiority and the impotence of its own defense force. At Iwo Jima, the Corsair not only won the battle against the Zero, but also dominated the psychological battlefield, ensuring that its legacy would not only be one of destruction, but also of unforgettable terror.
The F4U Corsair was undoubtedly a product of American engineering at the height of the war. It wasn't just an airplane, it was a flying fortress, an audacious design that combined the overwhelming power of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine with a robust structure capable of withstanding incredible punishment. The technology behind the Corsair was a work of mechanical art, but on Iwo Jima, its effectiveness translated into pure brutality. It was a cruel demonstration of how technology could transform a hunk of metal into a relentless predator, capable of reaching the enemy where they felt most secure. Their brutality had a name: rockets and napalm. HVAR, high-velocity aircraft rockets with their 127mm warheads were essentially heavy artillery fired from the air with the precision of a fighter jet. Their launch sounded like a thunderous hiss, and their impact a flash of fire and metal that could pulverize seemingly indestructible shelters. To the enemy, it was a weapon of pure terror, but the most feared weapon of all was napalm. Dropped in aerodynamic tanks, this incendiary gel spread in a sea of flames, burning everything in its path. For the Japanese soldiers hiding in the caves, napalm was hell in liquid form. It seeped into the holes, consuming the oxygen and turning the subsurface into a furnace. There was nowhere to hide. In the midst of smoke and explosions, stories of courage emerged. Stories that intertwined and complemented each other, linked by the sound of the Corsair. For the pilots, flying over Iwo Jima was an act of calculated bravery.
They controlled a monster of the skies, but they had to fly low and slow, less than 50 meters above the ground, to find their camouflage targets. This was the territory of Japanese snipers and anti-aircraft guns. With every dive, with every burst of machine gun fire, they risked everything. The visibility from the cockpit was poor, and they had to rely entirely on their instincts and the coordinates radioed by forward air observers on the ground, who were often just meters from the target. A Corsair flight over Iwo Jima was no walk in the park. It was a demonstration of mutual trust. And this trust was completely reciprocated. On the ground, the Marines lived a nightmare. Pressed by artillery and cornered by an invisible enemy, they felt a desperate helplessness. Death could come from anywhere, from a machine gun hidden behind a rock, a sniper's rifle, or a grenade thrown through a tunnel. Their exhaustion was complete. It was in this context of hopelessness that they heard the sound of the Corsair approaching. And for them, the fighter's howl was not the whistling death, but the symphony of salvation. The sight of its crooked wing silhouette was an immense relief. For them, it was the promise that they were not alone, that hell would, for a moment, recede. And on the other side, there was the enemy. Japanese soldiers trapped underground in the claustrophobic darkness of the bunkers could hear the sound of the fighter approaching. For them, the howl was not a sound of hope. It was the last sound many of them would hear. It was the helplessness of watching the enemy dominate the air while they were trapped in a maze of rocks and tunnels. The roar of the engine mixed with the hiss of the cut air became a harbinger of the end. They knew victory was impossible and that death would come from above. The Corsair's howl became the symbol of total air power, a battle cry that pierced not only the rocks but also the soul. For many soldiers, it was the last sound they heard. The Corsair was proof that technology is not neutral. It translates into power, and that power in the hands of brave men can be used for unimaginable brutality, but also for saving lives. On Iwo Jima, the Corsair became a symbol of a terrible contradiction, an instrument of destruction that was, at the same time, a guardian angel for the men on the ground. With the relentless support of the Corsairs and the naval artillery that pounded the island relentlessly, the American Marines achieved what seemed impossible: advancing. It wasn't a quick advance, nor a glorious one. It was a brutal advance, meter by meter, bunker by bunker, cave by cave. The island wasn't falling in a day, but in a 36-day inferno. With each Japanese position destroyed by an airstrike, another step was taken toward victory. The Marines, exhausted and under constant fire, depended on the Corsair's firepower as their very salvation. The Corsair became the key piece the infantry needed to break through the enemy's underground defenses. The fighter's 500-kilogram bombs and HVAR rockets tore through the concrete defenses and tunnel entrances, sealing them and forcing the Japanese out into the open. It was this combined effort of ground sacrifice and air power that turned the tide of battle. And it was under this aerial dominance that one of the most iconic scenes of World War II occurred: the American flag raised on Mount Suribaki. Mount Suribaki, with its imposing volcanic form, dominated the landscape of Iwo Jima, and its summit was a fortress of bunkers and machine gun nests. Its capture was vital. On February 23, 1945, a group of Marines climbed the mountain. They didn't know they were about to make history. When the first American flag was raised atop the volcano, a cry of victory echoed across the island and throughout the Pacific. The troops' morale soared. The image, immortalized in an iconic photograph, became the symbol of conquest. What many don't remember is that the second flag, the one in the famous photo, was only raised because the first was deemed too small. The flag on Iwo Jima was raised not by an army, but by a handful of men. The symbol of conquest would not have been possible without the sacrifice on the ground, without the perseverance of the men who crawled across the black sand, and without the power of the heavens. The Corsair, with its deafening howl, did not raise the flag, but it cleared the way for it to be raised. But victory on Iwo Jima came at a devastating price. The battle, which lasted more than a month, was a massacre. General Kuribashi kept his promise. Of a garrison of some 22,000 Japanese soldiers, only 1,083 survived, most seriously wounded or captured. For the Americans, the price was equally brutal. Nearly 7,000 men died in the battle, and more than 19,000 were wounded. Every advance cost lives. Every victory was paid for in blood. To put it in perspective, the Marine infantry suffered more casualties on Iwo Jima than the U.S. Army suffered in the first 4 weeks of the Normandy campaign. And even with the flag raised, the feeling was ambiguous, an undeniable military triumph, but also a profound mourning for an inevitable massacre. Victory was won, but it was a victory that left deep scars. The glory of the iconic photograph of Mount Sudibaki contrasts with the indescribable horror of the fighting in the island's caves and tunnels. The Corsair, flying above the inferno, witnessed and participated in one of the bloodiest battles in history, and the price paid for victory would be a weight the nation would carry forever. The island of Iwo Jima was the definitive proof of the Corsair's power, but it was also a testament to the ferocity of war and the terrible truth that even in victory, the shadow of destruction never fades.
The F4U Corsair emerged from Iwo Jima with its reputation cemented. The aircraft, nearly abandoned by the Navy itself, labeled too dangerous for aircraft carriers, emerged from the hell of Iwo Jima as one of the most powerful and versatile fighters ever built. For the Marines, it was a symbol of salvation. For the Japanese, it was the ghost of the skies. And in military history, it became a legend, not only for what it did, but for the psychological impact it caused. But the Corsair's legacy didn't end with the end of World War II. With the advent of the jet age, many believed the piston-engine aircraft would be quickly retired. However, the Corsair, with its robustness and versatility, proved irreplaceable. It remained in service for decades, actively participating in the Korean War, which became its stage for a brilliant second act. While early jets like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-86 Sabre dominated high-altitude air-to-air combat, their speed and fuel consumption made them ineffective for close air support. This is where the Corsair shined. Its cruising speed was ideal for hovering over the battlefield for long periods. Its payload capacity was unmatched, and its durability made it resistant to anti-aircraft fire. The Corsair became the air cargo mule, carrying bombs, rockets, and devastatingly, napalm to destroy enemy convoys and fortified positions. Its brute force was the perfect solution for ground warfare, and its presence became as reliable for troops on the ground as it was at Iwo Jima. The Corsair influenced not only combat tactics, but also the design philosophy of Vought, its manufacturer. Its go fast, go heavy mentality echoed through generations of military aircraft. Its direct successor, the Vought F-8 Crusader, known as the last of the machine gun fighters in the jet age, inherited the philosophy of a large aircraft with a powerful engine and brutal maneuverability that set it apart from its competitors. Later, this same approach would manifest itself in the Vought A-7 Corsair II, a jet attack aircraft that, with a respectable name, continued the close air support tradition of its legendary predecessor. But the Corsair's most profound legacy is cultural. It transcended the battlefield to become an icon. In movies, books, and documentaries, its image has lived on.
The 1970s TV series Baa Black Sheep, which dramatized the adventures of a Corsair squadron in World War II, cemented its image in popular culture for a new generation. Today, the vast majority of the more than 12,500 Corsairs built live only in photographs and history books. Only a handful of them, meticulously restored and maintained by enthusiasts, are still airworthy. And when one of these survivors takes off and the pilot thrusts the engine forward, preparing for a high-speed pass, the sound returns. The howl, that piercing whistle that once spread terror across the Pacific Islands, now echoes with a different meaning. It is no longer a sound of death, but a sound of reverence, a testament to human ingenuity in times of crisis, and a reminder of the sacrifice made by those who piloted it. The F4U Corsair is not just a collection of metal, wires, and pistons. It is a legend whose howl, however faint and distant, refuses to die. A sound that will forever haunt and inspire the memory of aviation. When the engines finally shut down and the dust settled over Iwo Jima, only silence remained. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but a heavy, oppressive silence, marked by the silence of the nearly 27,000 dead who lay in the black sand and craters. That deafening sound of war, the roar of the cannons, the crash of the bombs, the screams of the men, all were replaced by emptiness. The Corsair, once the loudest voice in hell, is now also remembered for the void it left behind. Its glory as a machine, its technological beauty, contrasts starkly with the destruction it wrought. And it is precisely this contrast that transforms it into something greater than just an aircraft. In every twisted piece of metal, in every destroyed bunker, the Corsair left its mark. It was a testament to human ingenuity in times of crisis, a machine born of necessity and urgency. It was the epitome of resilience, capable of withstanding incredible punishment and still flying. But above all, it became the symbol of a terrible contradiction, an instrument of destruction that was at the same time a guardian angel for the men on the ground. Its brutality was salvation. Its presence was the line that separated life from death. And here we return to our initial question. What happens when a machine encounters the bloodiest battlefield in history? The answer is clear and painful. A legend is born. Yes, a legend forged in fire and steel, but also in blood and tears. The Corsair became immortal in the memory of those who saw it, but this immortality is burdened by the weight of thousands of lives lost. The scars that never heal are not only in the landscape of Iwo Jima, but also in the souls of the men who lived to tell the tale. The legend of the Corsair is not only about its glory, it is about the terrible price paid for it. And now the final reflection. If the sound of the Corsair announced death in 1945, what does it teach us today about the price of war? Today, when we see a Corsair at an air show, the sound of its radial engine is greeted with reverence. People gaze at it with awe, like a precious relic of a bygone era. But we cannot forget the sound it made as it flew over the hell of Iwo Jima. We cannot forget that, for many, that howl was not a sound of freedom, but a sound of doom. It reminds us that every military achievement, no matter how glorious, carries with it a human weight impossible to erase. The story of the Corsair and Iwo Jima is an eternal reminder that war is a tragedy, and that the legends born of it are in fact the echoes of a suffering that should never be forgotten. The Corsair's howl today is fainter and more distant, but it refuses to die, haunting and inspiring the memory of aviation forever.